Well, thank you, Amy, for hosting us. Thank you again for the invitation to do this for our church and for allowing the Westar community to participate. It's great to have so many of you here again. I hope you found this useful, beneficial, and let me go ahead and get set up. I'm going to share my screen right now and make sure that things are working. I know if I've not done it correctly, Eric or someone really smart will let me know. Okay. All right. You should see my PowerPoint right now. If you don't see that, someone speak up, please.
It's perfect, Perry.
Great, great. So we're discussing the book After Jesus Before Christianity by Aaron Verncombe, Brandon Scott, and Hal Taussig. And before we begin, let me remind you, if you aren't aware of it, that, whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But Westar this Wednesday is hosting David Congdon, who's going to be talking about the overlooked legacy of Rudolf Bultmann, The Quest for the Essence of Christianity. Some of you may know that Bultmann was one of the really important figures in New Testament studies and New Testament theology in the 20th century. And Congdon, who's written 2 books on Bultmann, will be discussing that legacy. And you can go to the Westar site. I've put it here on the slide and register. This one will cost you a little bit, but I think you'll very much enjoy it. So that's 2 nights from now, the 9th, 7:30 to 9. So tonight we're going to be talking about the centrality of Israel for the Jesus groups in the first 2 centuries. I had the pleasure of doing a program for Westar back in December with my good longtime colleague, Bob Miller, on this very topic. And so some of you who may have heard that December program will hear some of this, but I've tried to deviate from it in some ways that hopefully it won't be just a repeat for you. So one of the things that we want to remind ourselves is that, of course, the movement associated with Jesus began as a Jewish or Judean movement. Jesus and his followers were all Judeans. The issue of Jew, Jewish, Judean is discussed in the book, and I will sometimes try to be a little more etymologically correct, and then other times I'll probably just fall into the standard usage of the term Jewish or Judaism. But all of the early followers in the first few years would have been Judeans. But as we know, that the movement very quickly began to spread beyond the geographical boundaries of Judea and Galilee, traditional territory for Jewish people, Israelite people. We know that there were major Judean or Israelite communities in Egypt. It's been estimated that as much as 40% of the population of Alexandria, Egypt, was Jewish or Judean. We know that there was a major community of Judeans in Syrian Antioch, which we know from the book of Acts and Paul's letters and other sources was a place where this movement gained a foothold. So in the background, we always want to remember that throughout the Mediterranean world, which was primarily part of the Roman Empire, but there were some parts that were even beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. There were communities of Judeans. We call this diaspora Judaism, and that's not an incorrect term, but we do need to remember these were people who were, in a sense, immigrants, refugees of a sort. Many of them were second, third, fourth, maybe even in some places sixth or more generations. In fact, it's been estimated that as much as 80% of the Judeans in the ancient world lived outside of the geographical boundaries of Israel. So one of the things that we want to remind ourselves of is that these diaspora, or if you prefer, these immigrant communities of Judeans, had found a way to live communally, live in ways that they could hold on to and affirm their identities without being totally subsumed by the larger culture. Now, with that said, I would quickly add that after the Greeks and followed by the Romans, this area, the Mediterranean, had been thoroughly Hellenized. That is, the influence of Greek culture, especially the Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek worldviews, et cetera, had completely infused the cultures of that period. That is why, for example, more than 100 years before the birth of Jesus, the Hebrew scriptures had been translated into Greek. And most of you know a little bit about that. It came to be known as the Septuagint. That comes from the Latin word for 70, because the legend is that 70 scholars from Jerusalem came to Egypt and translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. So when we see writers like Paul or Matthew, for example, quoting the Jewish scriptures, they're usually quoting from the Septuagint, or at least they're citing it from memory. So what we might say more about this a little bit later, but the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the Hebrew scriptures, became very early on part of the scriptures of the Jesus communities. This is just a nice picture here of the synagogue in Ostia, which was the seaport of Rome. Here's another brief little plug. The end of this month, March 30th, Westar is hosting a program with Michael White. He's a longtime Westar fellow, and he is the project director of the Ostia Synagogue project. He's actually in the process of writing the final report, and he's going to give us a program March 30th and summarize the exciting finds that his crew have come up with. You don't want to miss that. He is a scintillating scholar. So let me ask this question, and you can respond in the chat. If you were not an Israelite, not a Judean, what might have attracted you to the Judean way of life or the Jewish way of life, especially if you're living in a place like Antioch or Alexandria? So I'm going to probably have to stop sharing for a moment so I can see what kind of responses we're getting. Steve asked, while early Jesus groups were made up primarily or totally of Jews, how well were they accepted by Judeans, since they were committed to the anointed? Good question. We still have to imagine that the Jesus movement within Israel itself was probably relatively small. Probably initially a few hundred. Where I personally think it had its strength was in the Galilean villages, which unfortunately, aside from the little hints in the Synoptic Gospels and a little bit in the Gospel of John, we just don't know much. There were probably some villages near Jerusalem in the south and the geographical region of Judea that had some Jesus followers. I think the Gospel of John comes from one of those communities. But the numbers must have been small. And again, to kind of anticipate something I hope to get to a little bit later, whatever an outsider of these Jesus groups thought, you might not have agreed with them. You don't see these folks as other than Judeans, other than Jews. You might not agree with them. You might not share their conviction that Jesus is the anointed one, but they're a variety of Jew or Judean like yourself. The parting of the ways issue that I want to come to later just isn't a factor at this time. Russ asked if I was hungry and they gave out food, I'd convert. Russ, you put your finger on something I think useful. These Jesus groups didn't have the corner on kindness and generosity, of course, and neither did Judean communities, but they were, shall we say, better geared for it, better primed for it than maybe some other groups. And I think that the organization of Judean communities in the diaspora provided some sorry, I get a little automatic muting sometimes when there's a problem with my signal. I had to unmute myself again. So I think there was probably some sort of a better institutional ability of these diaspora communities. So yes, you know, if there's some kind of outreach for indigent or suffering people, and you've got a Judean community that provides assistance, that's surely going to have some appeal. Eric says, in response to the question, what might have attracted a non-Jew to become attached to one of these communities? Cover all the bases by adding a Judean God to the ones you're already worshiping. Better safe than sorry. I imagine there were some of those, yes. You might get invited to the Sabbath services, but you're not going to be allowed to fully convert until you are willing to put away those other gods. Amy says the tight community of followers, a strong sense of belonging. Eleanor says people might have been interested in hearing the Hebrew scripture. Let's see, here's someone repeating something said earlier. Bob, overall relationship to God embodied in the sense of things. Christina says, if I were a non-Judean and I were not benefiting from Rome and its occupation, I might consider conversion. It might be freeing, especially for women, the ideas of chosen family, etc. Okay, well, that's a great start. Thank you all. Let me get back to my screen share. Okay. So some of you will recall this from the book After Jesus Before Christianity. It was one of the observations in what was the reading for tonight? Chapter 9, belonging to Israel. So the practices of the Jewish people were diverse, but there were some constancies in their traditions and their literature, and so what the three authors of After Jesus Before Christianity have done here is just highlighted three that they think would have been attractive. And one was in a sea of I hesitate to use the word paganism. That has such a negative connotation. But in the religious world of non-Judeans, you've got this multitude of gods, and they perform different functions. But for Israel, there's the simplicity of a single deity who rules the world with goodness, whose desire for his creatures is benevolent. The Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, provided a set of high moral standards. And by the time we get to the Roman period, many intellectuals in the Greco-Roman world were familiar with, some of this. And we do have these non-Judean writers commenting on the high moral standards of the Jewish scriptures. There were some other parts to it that they found, quite odd. The Judean kosher laws, the demand for circumcision of males struck them as unsavory, but they recognized that much of the moral teaching, the moral standards, were quite admirable. And even when the Greco-Roman populations found Judeans odd, they respected the antiquity of their traditions. They knew that their writings, the Judean writings, the Torah, were very, very old as anything else they could imagine. And that carried a lot of weight in the ancient world. So someone who has been in one of these, who lives in one of these cities that has a local synagogue community, might attend because they're curious about, they're interested in this idea of a single deity who is benevolent. He or she may be attracted to the communal life where the moral standards of the community are lived out. And as someone mentioned, they might appreciate listening to the Jewish scriptures recited and expounded in a community. So I thought the little prequel of your response to that question set us up well for this. So what I'm going to try to do is go through these three with a few examples and try to, of course, leave time on the other side for questions. You got to start with Paul. This is where I began with the December program with Bob Miller. Paul very explicitly in the first generation, because of his encounter with the risen, anointed Jesus, understood himself to have been sent out, commissioned by God and the anointed Jesus to the nations, or the Gentiles, as we are used to think. I'm using the Authentic Letters of Paul translation again. And so whenever you see the word envoy, the Greek word there is apostolos, which is usually translated apostle. So notice here from Galatians, when the one who designated me before I was born and commissioned me to be an envoy chose to make his son known through me with the intent that I would proclaim God's world transforming news to the nations. Paul's language there echoes some of the kinds of language we hear in some of the Hebrew prophets, like Jeremiah. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And you can almost see Paul kind of reaching for that, as he's composing that line from Galatians. And so as Paul pondered his experience with the risen Jesus and what this meant in terms of God's larger plan, he came to the conclusion that by the raising up of Jesus the Anointed, God was opening a way for the nations to inherit the promises that God had made to Abraham. The promises to Abraham's children, which is primarily Israel, now also includes the nations. And so you see that line there from Galatians 3. And Paul considered this perfectly in keeping with the flow, the arc of what for him were simply the scriptures. We call it the Jewish scriptures. For him, they were simply his scriptures. I took a line here from After Jesus, Before Christianity, talking about the appeal of Israelite traditions for some people. And he says, the nations take seriously the invitation in Isaiah that all the people of the world are welcome to be a part of that nation of Israel. And they didn't provide any quote or anything, so I thought it might be useful to provide just one from the prophet Isaiah, which many scholars have argued is probably echoing in Paul's mind as he thinks about his mission as well. This notion that the temple in Jerusalem will become a house of prayer for all the peoples or the nations is part of the promise to bring in the nations into covenant or into relationship with Israel's God. And you don't have to go far in Paul's literature or others for that matter to find the goodness of God emphasized. Chapter 8 in Romans is just one of these passages that is overflowing with riches on this. So I just pulled a few things out. The rule of the Spirit of life that was in the anointed Jesus has liberated y'all, from being ruled by seductive corruption and death. For by sending God's own Son, God did what the law of Moses was not capable of doing. God condemned the corrupting power that attends our earthly life, so that the just requirement of the Mosaic law might be fulfilled in us, who live not according to the ambitions of a self-serving earthly life, but according to God's purposes and power. A few verses on, all who are led by the power and purpose of God are the children of God. You haven't received a slave spirit that will lead you back to a state of fear, but you received a spirit of adoption, by virtue of which we call out, Abba, Father. God's power and presence joins us in affirming that we are God's children. And if we're God's children, then we are also heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with the anointed, since we experience the same abuse as he did in the hope that we may share in his exaltation. And then the chapter ends with these magnificent words. If God is for us, what does it matter who's against us? How can we think that the one who did not spare God's own son from suffering and death, but allowed this to happen to him for our sake, will not also graciously give us, along with him, the whole world? I'm convinced there's nothing in death or life, the present or the future, nothing from fallen angels, nor from political authorities, nor from any other powerful force, nothing above the earth, below the earth, nor any other created thing that can separate us from the love of God that has been made known through the anointed Jesus our Lord. Wow. Yeah, I mean, just the beauty, the experiential power of that. And I recall for you again, something we talked about earlier in our study, the imperial context. When Paul talks about the nations, I don't think any of them could forget that these are all nations conquered by Rome. And so that reference to the abuse of Christ really resonates with some of these people. So just a quick takeaway here. The raising up of Jesus, the anointed, for Paul marked the transition to the new age of God's salvific righteousness and peace. The God of creation, the God of Jesus, the anointed, is through Paul summoning the nations. And on the basis of their faith, they become heirs of God's promises to Abraham, the father of many nations, and Israel in particular. I wanted to step outside of the New Testament for just one example, another example. This comes from chapter 12 in After Jesus Before Christianity. It's simply titled A Prayer of Thanksgiving. It was discovered among the famous Nag Hammadi documents. So many of you will know what I'm talking about. I discovered from 1945. And I don't have space here to put it all on the slide or to read it to you, but I've given you the page numbers. It's just a lovely piece. And this prayer celebrates the kindness of the Father. It praises God because the worshipers are enlightened by your knowledge. God is described as the light of life, the womb of all that grows. I love that motherly image of God. And look at this mixed one. Oh, never-ending endurance of the Father who gives birth. So we worship your goodness. You know, just those life-affirming turns of phrase. You just get a sense of whatever community produced this and used this prayer, they really are in touch with that goodness that the Judean and the early Jesus movements celebrate. So let me invite you now in the chat to, if you can think of one, provide us with a favorite example of an early Christian text that for you illustrates the goodness of God, because I know there are a lot more out there than what I've included. I'll stop sharing so I can see what's in the chat. Pardon me. Bob put in John 3:16, for God so loved the world passage. I'm sure most of us know that one. Excuse me. Water went down the wrong way.
This is Nancy, for I am convinced that neither death nor life nor etc. shall separate us from the goodness of God.
Okay, thanks, Nancy. Well, let me get back. I'm not seeing a lot in the chat. Maybe there's more, and if so, maybe we can come back to it. But for the sake of time, let me move on. It won't surprise anyone for me to claim that we find in various documents within what became the New Testament and elsewhere a concern with a representation of high moral standards. Again, I would point you to Romans 12. That's just a wonderful chapter, sort of encouraging and exhorting the Roman Jesus followers in ways that are quite lofty. I appeal to you, friends, as recipients of the wondrous mercy of God, to dedicate every fiber of your being to a life that is consecrated and pleasing to God, which is what enlightened worship ought to be. And that whole chapter just goes into a wealth of detail that I can't represent here. And everyone, of course, knows how much ethical content and moral exhortation there is in the famous Sermon on the Mount from Matthew 5 through 7. Some of you will recall that line where Matthew's Jesus tells his audience, "You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." That's a pretty high standard. The letter of James, I'm not quoting it here, but it is a letter filled with moral exhortation that is quintessentially Jewish and yet comes from a member of a Jesus community. I wanted to take a moment to look at one that didn't make it into the New Testament, but it had quite an influence in the early Jesus movement. Some later church manuals of instruction were greatly influenced by this. It is called in Greek the Didache, which simply means the teaching or the instruction. And it begins with a choice. There are two ways, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between the two ways. On the one hand, then, the way of life is this. First, you will love the God who made you. Second, you will love your neighbor as yourself. What a great place to start, right? It's too long a document for me to go through it in detail, but I bring it up here because it's an effort to kind of bring that moral tradition from Israel to bear. And I'll say more about that with a quote here in just a minute. The way of life instruction includes an expanded version of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. It has a number of instructions that sound an awful lot like some we hear in the Sermon on the Mount, like if someone strikes you on the right cheek. But then it has a number of other exhortations that are efforts to spell out how to live within the community, within the world more generally. And I thought this line from the 3rd chapter just kind of encapsulates it. You will not exalt yourself, and you will not give boldness to your soul. Your soul will not be joined with the lofty, but with the just and the lowly you will dwell. My translation comes from this author, Aaron Milovich, and in this little commentary, it's only about 115 pages, he argues that the Didache came from southern Syria. Most would agree with him on that. And it provided a comprehensive step-by-step program used for the formation of a Gentile convert. And most scholars would date the Didache to the end of the 1st century, and Milovich would even argue a little bit earlier. I think it's one of those documents that simply grew over time, so that some parts of it may be mid-1st century, some parts of it may come from few decades later as the community has changed and adapted. And so you need to upgrade your instructions. But it does, I think, provide us with a kind of manual for a mentor, a teacher, to lead new initiates into this community and how they are expected to behave. And it won't, again, surprise anyone that in the Jesus movement, the writings of the Israelite scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, were extremely important. Think, for example, of the formula quotations in Matthew's gospel. Matthew, especially in the first 2 chapters, will be describing something involved in the events of Jesus' birth. And he'll say something like, all of this happened in order to fulfill what was spoken by prophet so-and-so. And then you get a quote, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, etc. And so what he's trying to do there, of course, is to demonstrate that the life and teachings of Jesus were predicted in the Jewish scriptures and are the fulfillment of those prophetic predictions. If we jump over to Luke's gospel, again, in his infancy narratives, he's got several speeches given to some of the Jewish characters, like Mary, Jesus' mother, and Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And they're beautiful pieces. Mary's Magnificat, her song of praise when she meets her cousin Elizabeth, just sounds like Hebrew poetry. It's written in Greek, and it's just one of those examples of how good the author of this gospel is. He's writing in Greek. He's probably very familiar with the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, and he can imitate that style extremely well. And he thinks that's totally appropriate for his characters in these early chapters. He goes back to the Jewish scriptures and the speeches attributed to usually Peter, but there's some others like Stephen in the book of Acts. I'm not going to read those for you, but again, this repository of writings that serve the author of Acts to create these wonderful speeches that are part of the way that he's communicating with the audience that is reading or hearing it read. And then one of the things that maybe in the future, if we've got time, I'd love to do more with the letter to the Hebrews. Many of you know that it's the only document in the New Testament that makes a case for Jesus being a high priest. And if you think about that a moment, it is a little odd because there's nothing in Jesus' actual genealogy that connects him with a priestly lineage. The author of Hebrews is aware of that. So he makes this interesting argument from Scripture. It's an extremely detailed argument from Scripture that Jesus is the spiritual descendant of this kind of shadowy figure from the book of Genesis called Melchizedek. He's the king of Salem and also a high priest. And he cites a passage from Psalm 110 that for Hebrews means that the anointed one will be the priest after Melchizedek. And so he goes on to make this case that Jesus is the legitimate spiritual descendant of Melchizedek, and therefore his is a superior high priesthood to the actual Judean high priest in Jerusalem. It's a fascinating scriptural argument. And then I want to maybe try to begin to close with a mention here of this guy, Justin Martyr. Martyr was not his last name. He's known as Justin the Martyr. because by tradition he suffered a martyr's death. We can date his writing to around the year 160 of the Common Era. Not much of his work has survived, but we've got parts of 2 apologies, defenses of the faith. And we've got this very lengthy document. It's quite a long piece. It's titled The Dialogue with Trypho. And Justin represents it as a conversation between himself and a Jewish teacher named Trypho. And it's clear that Justin takes the Jewish scriptures very seriously. Not surprisingly, he reads them in a way that always supports his view of the anointed. He keeps reading the Jewish scriptures, what we would say Christologically, that is, as anticipations of, predictions of the coming of Jesus, the anointed. And he even ends up arguing for a spiritual interpretation of the Jewish scriptures as the true interpretation, and flat out declares that the followers of the anointed are the true Israelite race because we read it correctly. You, Trypho, learned though you are missing the boat. And I want us to recognize the contrast here. For Paul, the nations are incorporated into Israel, but for Justin, the nations who have become followers of Jesus have become the true Israel. They have replaced the physical Israel or the fleshly Israel. And that not everyone would have agreed with Justin, but he's a sign of where things were beginning to go. I've got more I could do. I think chapter 12, Feasting and Bathing and After Jesus Before Christianity, has some very interesting things to say related to the topic of Israel centrality. But I think for the sake of time, I'm going to leave this and come back now and give you a chance to ask questions that you may have. So while I'm getting out of this, feel free to use the raise your hand feature, or if you prefer to enter your question in the chat, I'll try to keep track with that. Yes, Robert. Go ahead. Welcome again from Australia.
That's right. It's nice to be with you. Look, I've found it very fascinating that the early Jewish communities, or early Jesus communities, were so closely associated with Judea. Although, as it's set out in the book, and as you've been saying, there were reasons for that: the one God idea and the very good moral sort of precepts that were there. And I think that probably, it sounds from reading the book, that the Jesus communities were drawn to Jesus because of his martyr status and the fact that he had been killed by the Romans, but that he died still living out his commitment and his understandings. One thing that I was interested in was, to what degree did the early Jesus communities know of Jesus' resurrection? Were they aware of the sort of resurrection theology, or were they mainly attracted to the fact that he was a martyr who died for his principles?
Well, great question. For Paul, resurrection and martyrdom are intertwined. There's been a lot of good work done in the last 30, 40 years on that relationship. George Nicholsburg, I think 30, 40 years ago, did this analysis of Jewish martyr stories and traced the idea of resurrection to those stories. So that the idea of resurrection gains a foothold in Jewish thought because it becomes a way for the person who dies for his or her Jewish faith to be vindicated by God. It's a way for God's justice to be demonstrated. And I think that's something that you see in Paul. It's something that you see in the passion narratives of the Gospels.
But then in the early Jesus communities didn't necessarily have access to the gospel, with Mark not written until 70 and so on.
Correct.
And sometimes presumably they didn't have access to Paul's letters in a lot of these early communities either.
No, you're right, but it seems that these martyr traditions were very well known. Those are around even apart from Paul and the Gospels. They're just not about Jesus yet. It's that framework of the martyr who dies unjustly for God's cause and is raised up, vindicated by God, is a template, we might say, that works very well for Paul and many in the Jesus movement to articulate what's going on in the story of Jesus. I would add that there are other places where Paul's understanding of resurrection is not shared. There might be other versions of resurrection. You get in, for example, in some of the Nag Hammadi documents, like the Gospel of Thomas, not so much this emphasis on Jesus as the martyr who was raised from the dead, but more the sense that resurrection signals that the divine wisdom that is Jesus is revealed, and that is something that is accessible to any believer. So it's a different it's resurrection in a different key, I think. And in a world that is where death is so much a part of daily life, something like 40 to 50% of all children did not survive to their 5th birthday, where the life expectancy on average, there are always exceptions, was maybe mid-20s for a woman, mid-30s for a man. The hope of some sort of state beyond the physical world certainly has great attraction, right?
Thank you.
Sure. Arthur, you've got your hand up. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, the book, I read the sections on this topic of identifying with Judeans, but the book doesn't address the difficulties in doing that in light of the Jewish war, the first and second Jewish wars, and the fact that Jesus's crucifixion he was crucified as a criminal for sedition against the Roman Empire. And those must have posed great challenges in terms of people being willing to identify with Judea. It's kind of like people in Russia this week protesting the Ukrainian war, So, and what I see in a lot of the other analyses is that, they did identify with Judea, at least up till the first Jewish war. But then there began a process where the theology or mythology, if you will, gets more integrated into Greco-Roman Mediterranean traditions having to do with their own philosophy and God's religion. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I'll try. It's a really good question, and you're right. It's not something that the book really goes after. I know that there were a lot of conversations about this. I think this is one of the things that, as it were, ended up on the editing floor. There have always been conversations within our discipline about when the so-called parting of the ways occurred. That is, where did Judaism and Christianity split and begin to diverge? And some have said, like you've suggested, that after the first failed rebellion of Rome, Israel against Rome, or perhaps the second one, which occurred 2 generations later, maybe that's where. And that's part of the ongoing conversation. The very fine Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin was arguing that the parting of the ways was much later than what we think. He was not willing to allow for any parting of the ways before the 4th or even 5th centuries. But you'd have to read his work to get his case for that. I do think that the wars with Rome complicated things in some places, because in some of the towns and cities near the war, these tensions broke out. In Antioch, for example, Josephus in the First Rebellion describes violence perpetuated against Judean communities in Antioch from Gentile community, the larger Gentile community, because of anti-Judean sentiment caused by the war. So those were complicating factors. And I personally have wondered if some of the documents that we have that are beginning to part that water, as it were, are trying to put some distance between Jesus followers and Jews. That might be going on with something like Justin Martyr. I think it might be something that's happening in the book of Acts. I didn't do it tonight, but my presentation in December suggested that the book of Acts is beginning to go down that road of claiming that the followers of Jesus are the true Israel, and those Israelites who didn't believe have forfeited the promises that God made to them. And you wonder, where is that coming from? You couple with that in the book of Acts that Roman officials come across pretty well in the book of Acts. They are depicted as irrational, bloodthirsty thugs. They're usually trying to do the right thing, and when they get the right information, that's what they do. So I suspect that the book of Acts is trying to present a face to the larger Roman culture. We Jesus followers are not your enemy. Get to know us. You'll understand we're not a threat. What you've heard about us from our opponents within the Judean community, that's the problem, because it's almost always jealous Jews that are causing problems in the book of Acts. That's just the beginning of an answer, but I hope it begins to address your concern.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I think we got time for one more. Anyone else want to raise their hand?
Could you just repeat the name of the scholar you mentioned?
Yes, I'll put it in the chat here, but his name is Daniel Boyarin, Boyarin. And the title of the book is not coming to me, but I think you can probably just Google it and you'll get it. I'm typing that in now. Amy, I'm gonna give it back over to you. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your staying with me, and I hope that what we've done tonight was helpful. And we've got one more session next week. So Amy, take us out.